Good evening and welcome to the Bunker Show this evening. Coming to you from our secret Westminster Bunker down below the sewers of the Houses of Parliament, where tonight with our bunker, in our Bunker Show, we've got a bit of a skeleton crew with no Helen this evening, but my co-host Jimmy is with me this evening.
Well, howdy Fabrice and howdy everybody out there. You know, it's a little bit gloomy down here without the bright shining grin of the Helen. Miss you. Hi, Helen.
But we've got a hell of a show for you this evening, and a wonderful guest who has been a member of Reinvestigate 9/11. Old Labour Economist Martin Summers is a regular on the politics show on Bristol Community FM, which is a must-see on a Friday evening. His roundup of the world's hotspots is incredibly informative. So thank you for coming and joining us this evening, Martin.
Hello, I hope everybody can hear me.
Hello, that's great. Thank you very much for joining us, Martin. How did you come to end up doing what you're doing, investigating the things that the media don't look into and the news that seems to slip below the radar? And how did you come to investigate, I guess, so many of the more murky sides of political life?
Well, I'm 55 years old, so I was 17 in 1977 during the punk revolution, and we all started asking lots of questions at that very early stage. So I went to Oxford University in that year when I was 17, and I immediately was questioning everything. And at that stage, of course, we had things like the struggle in Ireland, so I got involved in supporting the IRA hunger strike. I was very interested in what was going on in Italy, because we had a sort of radical movement emerging, which seemed to have all sorts of new ideas, but it kind of spiraled down into a kind of violent confrontation with the state, which we now know to have been orchestrated by the deep state. But at the time, we didn't realise what was happening, although we had an interest in what was going on. So, and it's gone on from there, really. So, by 1980, I was taking a great deal of interest in what was going on in Poland, workers' rights there, and, you can fill in all the gaps in between. But I set off, as a late teenager, questioning things, and, if any late teenagers out there listening, there's no reason why you have to stop questioning things once you're over 25.
What was your first tangible moment that you can remember where you noticed the schism between what's presented by the mainstream media and reality?
Well, we didn't have things like the internet back in the day, so we were very dependent upon paper-based materials, radical magazines like The Leveller, for example. And, of course, it all seems rather quaint now, when you can have radio shows and TV shows and what have you. But back in the day, I made an effort to get hold of materials which were not mainstream materials. So there were things like Le Monde Diplomatique, the French newspaper, and I remember a number of other magazines which have all folded since, which I used to regularly read. Lobster, for example, I don't know if you remember that. That was about British intelligence activities. And it was very much a kind of, how can I put it, it was a niche market. There weren't that many people who were interested in these things, and the material was relatively difficult to get hold of. But nowadays, of course, it's not the case.
Yeah, I do remember seeing my first copy of Scallywag when I was quite young, and I was. It was one of those things. It's quite hard to remember now, before the age of the internet. And in fact, I was thinking back today. One of the first sites I ever looked up when I got my first internet connection was www.bilderberg.org, and I was absolutely blown away by the amount of research materials that were there. And I thought this internet's a truly good thing and it's going to keep me busy for quite a while. And it's been, I guess, following through, because that's a site which I know a lot of your work and a lot of your research features on, and a lot of the resources that you've brought to people's attention is on that exceptional resource that is still there.
Yeah, well, it wasn't my site. That's the site of my colleague Tony Gosling. And there are two comments I'd make about it. One is, if you look at the actual technical aspects of the site, it's very basic. But that, in a way, is brilliant, because it means, for example, that people in Africa with very basic equipment can access it. You haven't got lots of all singing or dancing stuff on there, and it doesn't get updated much. It just kind of gradually piles up. And the other thing that's interesting, of course, is that the Bilderberg Group back in the day didn't realise that they had to buy their own domain name to stop other people from buying it. So Tony, on the advice of, he will tell you the story himself, on the advice of people who I think it was Henry Kissinger's niece, bought the Bilderberg website. And of course, at that stage, they denied they even existed. They've now got a sort of skeletal public relations function. But back in the day, they denied they existed. Therefore, they didn't buy their own web name. And therefore, he bought it. And it led to a peculiar situation a few years ago where the Prime Minister of Malawi phoned him up and said, I'd like to go to Bilderberg, can you fix it? And he had to tell him, well, actually, I'm not Bilderberg, I'm a journalist. But it just goes to show that they can be flat-footed, these people. That they didn't realise the implications of what was going on, and they didn't take the necessary precautions to protect their own web name. And now it's too late.
Oh, that's a really that's a really lovely sort of thumbing your nose at the establishment with that. And of course, the interesting thing is when I first came across Bilderberg and I would mention it to people, people would raise an eyebrow and give the conversation a wide berth. And of course, now through lots of people's persistent efforts, the Bilderberg guest list was in the Daily Mail a few days ago, which is a real change. And do you think that that's the persistence of the people who are a little bit more thorough about getting their information, and the kinds of people who do listen to alternative viewpoints that are put forward in the more sort of community and alternative sort of based media?
Well, I think that's undoubtedly the case. On the guest list, I would suggest to you that there are probably people there who are not on the guest list as well. So they're not being completely open and honest about what they're doing. But as I say, a few years ago, they denied that they existed at all. And there is people like Tony Blair, for example, who denied that he had gone to Bilderberg, even though we have evidence that he did. So, and I don't think we should... Bilderberg is a key elite meeting for the formulation of policy, but in many ways I think policy is already formulated by the time they gather. My image of Bilderberg is like a gypsy horse fair, where the up-and-coming politicians are brought in to be bought by the real masters of the universe, the money men.
So Bilderberg in some way functions like an audition almost to see if they're really their man, I guess. Yeah. Because it's often when people are invited to Bilderberg that a few years later that they become even more influential than when they actually visited the meeting. Well,
indeed, it seems to be that if you go to Bilderberg, it's likely that you then end up being in charge of something subsequently. But on this point, I would make this point, that stopping the wealthy and industrialists and so on having a meeting is virtually impossible. And if they don't want anybody to know about it, then they're not going to let anybody to know about it. I think the real talking point for ordinary people is, if our political leaders are there, on what basis are they there? So George Osborne went to Bilderberg a few years ago and claimed that he didn't have to give any report on it because it was in fact a private meeting, although it was subsequently uncovered, I think by the Financial Times, that he'd taken one of his top civil servants with him. Now in that case, it's not a private meeting, it's a public meeting, and therefore we are entitled to ask for a minute or an account of what went on. And incidentally, Michael Meacher, the MP for Oldham, who was at the anti-Bilderberg protest in Watford a few years ago, he was the first parliamentarian in Britain to put forward an early day motion which was debated the following week, asking, well, what the hell went on at this meeting, because you've been there and you ought to report back to us. And I think that is the key thing. Why are the political leaders there if they're not prepared to discuss what they discussed after they've been to it?
Especially if they're taking along officials from the Treasury, then those are obviously paid for by people's taxes. They're obviously he's not there in an entirely private capacity if he's relying on the expertise of those kind of people. So those kind of questions that Michael Meacher asked are some of the acupuncture points, I think, that expose where the duality is between officials acting in a public capacity or when they're acting in a potentially corporate capacity or private interests.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this all sounds... I mean, we all know that things get cooked up behind closed doors. If it wasn't done at Bilderberg, it would be done somewhere else. And I think that's what allows some of the critics of the kind of things we say to say that we're obsessional about Bilderberg. But it isn't just Bilderberg. There's things like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and all sorts of private meetings which don't have any particular name. The point is that an Anglo-American financial elite working closely with the Israelis and the intelligence services of all those various countries are very definitely trying to steer events. And I don't think there's and no serious person can doubt that. And you know, the attempts to try and ridicule those who've questioned Bilderberg, I think, just blows up in the faces of those who raise it, because it's just so obvious that that's what's going on, that it's absurd to suggest that anything else. And the very fact that they've tried to prevent, you know, for years they denied they existed. I mean, why would you do that if you're an above-board organisation?
And there have been some quite interesting movers and shakers over the years. And I believe on the steering committee for quite a few years was a very prominent politician called Lord Peter Carrington. When I was a teenager, or maybe just before, actually, I think he was very senior in the Margaret Thatcher government, where at that time they had quite a lot of members of the cabinet working for N.M. Rothschild and Sons, who were very heavily involved in the privatisation of state assets at that time. And of course, that's something that an organisation like Bilderberg would probably have an interest in.
Yes, well, I mean, Peter Carrington is very interesting. Those who listen to our radio show in Bristol, and you can get all of the webcasts from www.thisweek.org.uk, it's all archived there. But one of the stories we've been pursuing is about Carrington and his role, in fact, in the Battle of Arnhem many years before the Falklands War, or the foundation of Bilderberg, because he was in command of the British armoured column, which was supposed to strike through to Arnhem and relieve the British paratroops who were holding the bridge. And in the film The Bridge Too Far, you will see him basically refusing to go forward, even though the bridge at Nijmegen had been seized by the 92nd Airborne, the American 92nd Airborne. And my colleague Tony Gosling has actually interviewed Captain Moffat Burrows, who's the commander at Nijmegen, and he said, and I'm quoting extempore, that I told Carrington I'd just lost loads of people capturing the Nijmegen bridge, and I wanted him to press on to Arnhem. Their guys were waiting 3 miles down the road. And Carrington said, my orders are to stay here. He said, I put my blankety-blank Tommy gun against his head. I said, you get this blankety-blank tank moving, I'm going to blow your blankety-blank head off. And Carrington then just slammed the hatch shut and didn't move. Now, we don't know for sure what the implications of this are, but we do know that ultimately the Bilderberg Group, when it first met in 1954, met at the Bilderberg Hotel in Oosterbeek, which was inside the Kessel within which the British paratroops were eventually surrounded and made to surrender. And the suggestions that we have been following up in put forward by Paul Manning, who wrote a book called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. He was a senior US journalist during World War II, probably the senior guy on the journalistic side of the American operation. And his book came out in 1984, I think, and it basically said that Bormann had escaped at the end of the war. And another very important book is Op JB by Creighton Davis, who was in fact a pseudonym for John Ainsworth Davis, and he was the commander of a very secret British Royal Marines commando team which went in to Berlin to extract Bormann at the end of the war. And this was all, the implication of all of this is that in actual fact a deal had been done after D-Day between Bormann and elements within the Western intelligence services, that he was basically the money man for the Nazis, and the Western intelligence services wanted to access the money that they had basically accumulated and things like that.
Well, they systematically looted, and what in today's money would be trillions from across, virtually every treasury that they took. And so, if the suggestion is that Lord Carrington, by not bringing forward the Grenadier Guards and breaking the and holding the Nijmegen Bridge, added months onto the war, which allowed Bormann to escape through Berlin to Italy, I think, using Vatican rat runs.
The suggestion is that he actually went to Britain before he went to Argentina. Although we're still not sure of all the details and the facts here. But in any case, leaving that aside, I think there is no doubt whatsoever that elements within the Nazi intelligence structure were welcomed with open arms into the newly formed NATO alliance. So Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, we can come to him, who was a major founder of Bilderberg, it was held in Holland because of him. He had been an SS officer, married into the Dutch royal family, and then supposedly changed sides so that he became an anti-Nazi. But in actual fact, the suspicion is he was imposed upon Montgomery as part of the planning team for Operation Market Guard. Montgomery didn't want it, but he was forced to accept it. And he said he would coordinate the Dutch resistance of things. But I think even mainstream historians accept that the Germans, by some means, had foreknowledge of the British plans. And the suggestion is that he was the conduit for that, through an agent known as King Kong, codenamed King Kong. But anyway, leaving aside all these rather arcane details, I think it's absolutely clear that the OSS, which became the CIA, and the whole creation of NATO was done with the help of ex-Nazis. For example, Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of the Gestapo in Eastern Europe, and he ran all of the Gestapo's operations in Eastern Europe, he becomes head of the West German intelligence services. Klaus Barbie, who was eventually brought back to stand trial in France in the 1980s for his behaviour during the war, had been used by the CIA to train the Bolivian army in torture techniques in the 1960s. Everybody's got a vague idea that ex-Nazis were given a sort of a bit of a nod and a wink and helped out. But in actual fact, it's, with the passage of time, this becomes clearer and clearer that that's what went on. And of course it explains an awful lot about the way the Western intelligence services have approached things like false flag terrorism and psychological warfare ever since. They're basically using fascist psychological warfare techniques, suitably modified ones. The problem is He wasn't that sophisticated at it. Bormann really was Hitler's brains.
And if Bormann had, we had Gordon Bowden on a few weeks ago who was talking about looting a country and taking governmental wealth and taking it offshore. And it seemed like Bormann was a pioneer of this. I think using the Bank of International Settlements, and as you mentioned, Reinhard Gehlen, and I'm sure everybody knows Werner von Braun, the rocket scientist who helped design the Apollo missions, the rockets for the Apollo missions, who were brought over through Operation Paperclip. But they're also, after the war, Reinhard Gehlen, as you said, took over the German intelligence operations. But there were also stay-behinds that were used in Operation Gladio, which were Nazi agents, I believe, originally intended to stay behind the lines in Western Europe, so that if the Berlin Wall fell and the Red Menace came streaming over, that these groups would organise resistance efforts.
Yeah, well, I'm presuming that your audience is sufficiently aware of all of these things that we're actually repeating stuff that they may have heard already. Gladio is absolutely key because it's been the source of Western terrorist atrocities ever since the 1940s.
Well, I guess just for those who don't know, I mean, you mentioned Italy earlier, and there was the Piazza Fontana, the Bologna railway station, which were a couple of atrocities where nearly 100 people died. I know 80 died in Bologna, and I think a dozen died in Piazza Fontana, which were, at the time, there was a strong communist party in Italy who looked like they may form part of a coalition. And the controllers of Gladio activated their agents, and they initiated false flag attacks, which were to make the strategy of tension, to encourage people to embrace right-wing domestic politics, and that I guess is part of the history of Gladio for those who don't know it, and also I guess in Belgium as well.
Yeah, I think it's not just us saying this. Fernando Imposimato, who is currently the honorary head of the Italian Supreme Court, in other words, the senior judge in Italy, he wrote a book a couple of years ago called La Repubblica dei Strani Impuni, the Republic of the Unpunished Massacres, in which he basically named the Western intelligence services as the main perpetrators of these terrorist attacks. And he said it's not based just upon my say-so, that he was the investigating officer, the investigating magistrate in many of these cases, including the Aldo Moro kidnapping. He was the Prime Minister of Italy. He was kidnapped and assassinated, supposedly by the Red Brigade.
So Fernando Imposimato is, I guess, the Supreme Court are some of the experts at mafia hunting. So they're used to catching professional criminals.
Well, indeed. That's true. There's another story that some of your audience may not have heard. You may have heard of the British historian E.P. Thompson, who wrote a famous book, The History of the English Working Class, and he was very prominent in anti-nuclear campaign in the 1980s. His brother, Frank Thompson, was parachuted into Bulgaria to link up with the Bulgarian partisans in 1944. And he was captured by the Gestapo and tortured to death over several days. But the Bulgarian authorities and others have subsequently uncovered that he was actually grassed up to the Gestapo by the OSS, the American Secret Service, because by that stage of the war, the idea of stirring communists up to drive the Nazis out had turned into a policy of basically thinking about what we're going to do when this is all over, and we need to find the good Nazis, inverted commas, that we can work with to fight against the communists. And I don't think even in the mainstream this is much disputed, but the implications aren't really thought through. Because the use of false flag terror in Bologna, for example, related something simple. If you're prepared to kill 80-odd innocent people in order to achieve a political goal, what's the difference between that and 3,500 on 9/11? And the answer is, morally, not much.
So, Martin, would you say it's safe to say that the spirit of Gladio is alive and well today?
Very much so.
Yeah. Could you point out any examples of any recent incidents?
An obvious point to make is what's been happening in the Ukraine, in Kiev, and elsewhere. Just over a year ago, last February, there was a big protest against the current government in Ukraine, the Yanukovych government. Lots of people of liberal persuasion who wanted a European future were out protesting in the streets, however mistakenly from some people's point of view. And then at some stage, the snipers, mysterious snipers, managed to shoot scores of protesters and a score of police officers, all with the same skill and using very, very sophisticated weaponry. And that is what led immediately to the transfer of power to the new coup regime, which then started the processes towards conflict with Russia that we've seen since then. Now, the Russian Secret Service, or I think it was the Ukrainian Secret Service of Yanukovych, managed to intercept a telephone call between Umas Piats, the Estonian Foreign Minister, and Catherine Ashton, the British head of the EU's Foreign Affairs Department, who said, I've just been around the hospitals and talked to all the doctors, and they're telling me that everybody's been shot through the head with the same caliber weapons, both police and protesters, and that the word on the street is that this was carried out by elements connected with the current regime, the new regime, the current regime in Kiev, not with the Yanukovych regime. Now that, to my mind, has all the hallmarks of an Operation Gladio operation, and the far-right militants who carried it out have links to Gladio going back to the days of Reinhard Gehlen. What do you think the Western intelligence services were getting when Gehlen was brought into the fold? He was running all of the agents in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, as what the Soviet Union then was, which were run by the Gestapo. So he basically handed over those networks to NATO in one go. This still matters today. It's not something that was just historical interest. It's still of current concern.
So how easy do you think it is for NATO to actually stage a Gladio type affair in light of the modern media? I mean, how do you think they get away with it?
It used to be because people like us, given the new technologies we have, are able to expose what they're doing much more quickly than was the case in the past. For example, that incident, the telephone conversation, which Piats, by the way, definitely said was a genuine conversation, so it's not a fabricated conversation. And the Estonians are very hostile to the Russians. I used to work in Eastern Europe. I know what people's attitudes are. They wouldn't have made that up. And the fact is that Russia today, an English language international TV station, is able to put this stuff out there in real time to critique what they're doing. And I don't think they're used to that, and they find it rather challenging. But so they should. Because up to now, up until very recently, they got away with all of this. I remember the definitive documentary on Gladio was made by a guy called Frankovich, and it was shown on BBC Two in 1993. And this was in the days before I even had a video recorder or whatever. So I remember watching these 3 one-hour time-watch films thinking, thank goodness for that, because I knew all about it. Thank goodness for that, this stuff has finally come out. It's been on mainstream TV. But you see these things once, and then never again. And Tony and myself actually found a copy of it in Falmouth College of Art and put it up on the internet. It's rather poor quality. But the BBC themselves have never rebroadcast it. But of course, given technologies, anybody can go and find it on the internet if they've got it.
Yeah, if they want to, it's on the Public Inquiry channel, spelled PUBLIC, Inquiry, ENQUIRY, and that's on YouTube, and you can find that's a really interesting documentary, and it's quite long. I think it's over 2 hours long. But
it's 3 hours. It's three one hour documentaries, separate films, and of course the way he'd done it was by being very, very he interviewed everybody. He's even got the head of the Italian Secret Service there saying, well, we found it very difficult to infiltrate the Red Brigades, but once we were in, we managed to get control of it quite easily. And that's the problem with all kinds of secretive organisations.
Well, having watched... I was going to say, having watched the Gladio documentaries, it looked like there was almost a shadow government operating in Italy for a number of years. I think the P2A Masonic Lodge was quite heavily involved. So making decisions sort of outside the governmental channels.
Well, I think that's the reality of the world we live in. There is the official, politics, like the general election that we've just had, and then there's the real world which goes on behind the scenes. The elections are not irrelevant, but they're not the only thing that's going on. And by and large, the population are woefully misinformed, deliberately so, about what's really happening and why. You do find, obviously, that people's life experiences expose them to more questioning ideas. If you go and chat on people in bars in West Belfast, they tend to have a rather more cynical view of these things than you're going to find if you wander around in lounge bars in Surrey. But the internet does give everybody a possibility to get up to speed, and we should use it, because things are still going on which are incredibly vicious and unpleasant. Virtually all of the so-called Islamist terrorist attacks, as far as I can see, are Gladio-style operations. There may be the way these things work is that they're genuinely misguided. Many of the people who joined the Red Brigade genuinely thought that they were fighting the state. But that doesn't matter, because the organisation itself is being used in a power play by the state. And that's the danger of that sort of thing.
Well, when you have the state, sort of, I guess in terms of Ukraine, there's been a resurgence of seemingly financed fascist groups across Europe. I know in Denmark they've had some quite serious issues with that, and obviously Ukraine is quite a shocking example. But if you have snipers from the top of buildings taking people out with headshots, then they're obviously very, very skilled professionals at that type of behaviour. And if some of that is a continuation of Gladio, I know that there's a gentleman who's looking into investigations of use of Deal barracks and the Thanet rifle range, I think, where they weren't sure if people were being trained in use of weapons that weren't sanctioned there, and at times that it wasn't allowed. And people suggesting that actually those kind of operations are backed by Western intelligence services. And when you have also corruption, as I said, we had Gordon Bowden on, and we spoke a little bit about Prince Bandar at one point. Now, he received kickbacks allegedly from a very big arms deal. He's also a very close friend with the Bushes. But he's recently, I think a few years ago, became head of the Saudi intelligence agency. And in that role was applying pressure on Vladimir Putin.
The same people keep reappearing in the story, don't they? And the thing is, you see, that they've encouraged both Islamist militants and fascists to operate, but they can't rely upon those people to carry out the actual physical attacks. So you have what the US analyst Webster Tarplin calls a three-pronged approach. You've got the moles, who are the real perpetrators, the patsies, who are made to look as if they did it, and the technicians who actually did it. So it may be that elements within the private sector carried out these shootings, because there's a suggestion that there was training taking place in Poland beforehand, and various Polish MPs are taking it. But it's also a lot easier if you just put some SAS guys in there to do it in the name of private sector, because they're actually properly trained to do it. And in actual fact, one of the stories that's been circulating that we haven't been able to confirm or deny is that it was actually British weaponry that was used in that cycle attack, which incidentally, of course, killed the liberal protesters against the pro-Russian regime, because that's how cynical these things actually are.
But, going back to what you were saying about the Islamist terrorist attacks reflecting the same sort of Gladio-style efficiency, would you say that, the level of expertise and actual professionalism, displayed in things like the Charlie Hebdo event, do you think it's quite plain that these guys aren't just, off the street?
I think the Charlie Hebdo event was very clear. And what was interesting about that was that there were two major critics of the official story on Charlie Hebdo. One was Jean-Marie Le Pen, who suggested that it was an Israeli false flag. And of course we can all snort and say, well, what does he know? He's a an unconstructed fascist ex-paratrooper who fought in Algeria, blah, blah. But the other person was President Erdogan of Turkey, who also said that he suspected that his visit was false flag. You say, well, what does he know? He's just an Islamic politician, whatever. But of course, Turkey had its own version of Gladio, which was called Ergonokon, which was based within the NATO army and involved lots of terrorist attacks, assassinations, bombings, shootings. And various generals in Turkey were ultimately caught and sent to prison for being involved in these networks. So it's not this ultimately people say, well, what's the solution to all of this? I would say it's quite simple. The civilian police have got to get serious about stopping terrorism, and that means they've got to get serious about dealing with their own security services, who are the main source of this terrorism. But they're going to need an awful lot of support from the general population if we're going to make this sort of stuff stick. But in the end, I think that's the only way. And it's the only way to deter and intimidate.
And I guess also it's shining a light on where the inconsistencies are, and also where the distraction is in terms of Charlie Hebdo. Because before that happened, for example, the French were considering their membership of NATO because it had been uncovered that NATO had been sanctioning the torture of prisoners. And had been quite involved with that, and that was taken off the geopolitical agenda. And after Charlie Hebdo, of course, French aircraft carriers were deployed to the Gulf.
Indeed. So, in other words, it's like the French socialists were having their chain pulled from somewhere. And of course, the Israeli role in all of this has to be recognised. Mossad are key players in this kind of false flag terrorism, but they're not the only ones. It's actually an axis of evil based in the city of London, in Wall Street, and with an outlying leg in Tel Aviv.
And with the whole kind of Charlie Hebdo sort of style events. Do you see them radiating around the world beyond Europe? Do you see them in places like the Pacific and such?
We saw a whole series of so-called copycat events, did we not? In Australia, Canada. I mean, if you've got a sense for this, you realise, why would all of these people independently suddenly do all these mad things just in the Anglo countries, which are all deciding where they stood on things like invading Syria and what have you. ISIS quite clearly is a completely constructed creature which serves multiple purposes. It can be a bogeyman, and at the same time it's used to carry out intimidation of political forces in the Middle East which are hostile to US and Western interests. And they're actually becoming very sloppy about this. False flag attacks used to be very carefully planned, carried out only in emergencies and only to achieve certain goals. But they've now become extremely sloppy with all of this, and they just keep piling on the agony.
So do you think, I mean, you mentioned the Westfield shopping mall in Australia, and they also had another Westfield incident in Africa, I believe, and the guy in Canada who marched into the Parliament, I think, looking like he had the intention to shoot people. And those are quite a number of incidents. I know that there's a lot of people who have looked into the Woolwich incident, the 7/7 incident, Building 7 with 9/11, and of course the Boston Marathon. And with the regularity of those things, do you think they haven't got enough distraction or enough ability to cover up the trail of dirt that often comes out when people see these things, so that they don't, if people remain vigilant, they don't actually have the option to exploit some countries with false flags because they become too dangerous or too much risk of exposure?
It's hard to know what goes through the minds of these psychopaths, but the fact is that on one level they have succeeded. The majority, I wouldn't say the vast majority, but the majority of people, and certainly the majority of the politically active people, MPs and so on, they tend to buy in to the official stories. I mean, I work in mainstream politics as well as doing stuff like this, and the general fear amongst mainstream political people, whoever they are, even for local councillors, is that they don't want to be branded as this, that, and the other. So they run a mile from confronting what this kind of thing. I mean, obviously, you've got an exception in Northern Ireland where people have been, they've been around the houses with all of this, and there've been various false flag attacks in Northern Ireland. Incidentally, there was a very good panorama programme, occasionally the BBC does rise to the occasion, about the British Army's role in Northern Ireland a few weeks ago, and in which basically they accused them of being involved in the murders of hundreds of people. And they quoted Muro Lone there, who was the head of the police ombudsman's office in Northern Ireland. Said, well, they've killed hundreds of people. Now, of course, most people in Britain think of the war in Ireland as something that happened on the moon with these crazy Irish killing each other, and then thank goodness they've dropped it now. Nothing to do with us. But of course, it was to do with us, just like a lot of other things.
Going back to what you're saying with the politicians, if they're afraid of upsetting the elite, constantly they're controlled, right then and there, even just on the fear of getting into office. But, how controlled would you say they are?
Pretty controlled. I mean, someone like Michael Meach was rather exceptional because he has been an MP for many years and is in fact the longest serving member of Labour cabinet. So he's been a cabinet member for longer than anybody else. And he is an honourable exception to all of this because he would understand virtually everything we're talking about here. But even he will not come out openly and say that they've done it because he doesn't want to be pigeonholed. And you can understand why that would be.
And I guess that's from the media pressure that can come with having a label. So do you feel that the mainstream media and any credibility that they can carry with them, do you think that's quite crucial in
for Michael Meach in particular? He's got other interests in things like GMO foods, for example, and other environmental issues, which he thinks are more important than the 9/11 false flag terrorism issue. But if you read his articles in things like The Guardian, he's pretty much put his finger on what's going on, and without going the whole hog.
Oh no, he was the first politician. I can remember back when 9/11 actually happened, a few months after the actual event, he wrote a really grilling article in The Guardian. I was quite amazed how outspoken he was. I mean, how many other politicians have you come across that are actually that prepared to be outspoken?
Even if they're smart enough to know what's going on, a lot of them aren't really smart enough to know what's going on. And then there's ones who are smart enough to know what's going on, or either involved or intimidated. You can see how different all this gets.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed in the election cycle that there was very, very, very little discussion of NATO and foreign policy. I mean, along with the child sex abuse inquiry, of course, and they seemed like they were kind of taboo subjects. So, as far as the media goes, do you think it's important for people to maybe make some of their elected representatives aware that NATO is a terrorist organisation and complicit in terrorist events where people get killed?
I think it is, and I think what's happened in Syria means that we've actually got some hard evidence to back that up. I mean,
speaking of Syria, I've been burning to ask this question of you all day. Have you heard about the Bradford jihadi wines?
Well, news earlier, yeah.
Yeah. What do you make of that?
Well, what happened a few weeks ago was that the Turkish police carried out 2 sets of arrests. They carried out arrests of people who were taking weaponry into Syria for ISIS, and then it turned out that the trucks were all owned by MIT, which is the Turkish intelligence services. And what subsequently happened is the police who carried out those arrests have themselves been arrested and charged with treason. The other thing was that the Turkish police arrested a British girl who was on her way into Syria to join ISIS, and they arrested the person who groomed her, and it turned out that he was working for the Canadian intelligence services. Now, in other words, the Western intelligence services have created these rat mines into Syria, and they're recruiting people and sending them there, presumably including British young people. And anybody who's listening who's from those communities, I would say you have nothing to do with this. This is being orchestrated by your enemies. They are the ones who set all of this up. And of course, these people are the patsies, the ones who are made to look as if they're responsible for this, that, and the other. Like we are told, for example, a British boy was a suicide bomber in an attack on an oil refinery in Iraq last week. But all we really know is that he's disappeared, and he may or may not have been involved in such an attack. We probably never know. And a lot of what I call suicide attacks aren't in fact suicide attacks in my view. They're straightforward car bomb or pole bomb attacks, which are suicide attacks.
And if Turkey is a NATO member, so if you have intelligence agencies running their own secret rat lines through Turkey, you also mentioned the Erdogan network of Gladio operatives in Turkey. So recently there were intelligence officers saying that they were hoping to engage with some of the Islamic community so that they can create a network in the Islamic community. Do you think that actually the number of people that seem to be getting into those kind of situations, that the huge majority seem to have intelligence agency connections?
Yeah, I'm afraid they do. I mean, my advice in a speech I gave in Birmingham Central Mosque a few years ago was that if you have information about terrorism, you should go to local police officers that you know and trust, and nobody else. You shouldn't cooperate with the intelligence services because, quite frankly, they are suspects. Individual intelligence officers may mean well. That's irrelevant when you think about the bigger picture. And we really need to get the civilian police force to do what it's supposed to do. And if you think about the Irish Republican movement's commitment to supporting the police service in Northern Ireland, you'll understand what I'm hinting at. In Colombia a few years ago, I visited Colombia 10 years ago with a trade union delegation, the army were planning under something called Operation Dragon to assassinate virtually all the political leadership of the Colombian trade unions, scores of people over 2 weeks. But just as they were about to carry out this plan, their army headquarters was raided by the police and everybody was arrested and computers were seized and so on. Nobody's been prosecuted, but this battle will be, going forward, a battle by civilian police against intelligence service-backed terrorism, with the ordinary population hopefully getting involved in supporting the genuine forces of law and order.
As far as the genuine forces of law and order go, there's been a recent proposition before Parliament about the Official Secrets Act and possible exemptions for the Official Secrets Act, and this is involving criminality involving politicians and institutional abuse. But do you think for this sort of institutional terrorism that maybe there should be provision for things like the Official Secrets Act to be suspended, and that actually people should maybe again fire off to their representatives in Parliament and make them aware that potentially these people are committing crimes with immunity and using our taxpayers' money to do so?
Well, I think so, yes. I mean, we've got to raise the terms of the debate. These attempts to bring in more snooping and all the rest of it, and of course it's always on the back of things like Charlie Hebdo. How ironic it is that Charlie Hebdo, which is supposedly about freedom of speech, to be insulting to others, then becomes an excuse to close down various websites for exercising freedom of speech to support various political points of view. Couldn't be clearer how completely twisted this is all becoming. And the way to clear all of this out is to speak honestly and openly to people. Look, Western intelligence services have a track record going back decades of bombing, shooting and killing ordinary citizens. When are we going to put a stop to it? Not if we continue to, denial is not just a river in Egypt, is it?
That's for sure. Denial is something which is reinforced by the mainstream media a lot. And I know the people who listen to the Bunker Show like to be active and like to get the word out in as many ways as possible. Do you have any suggestions for how they may do that? Well,
obviously, we're doing some of it now. I mean, our shows on www.thisweek.org.uk are all archived. So all the stuff we've there, all the people we've interviewed, it's all there for everybody to go through if they need to. But I think we've just got to get the basic idea that the Western intelligence services, I mean, they may not be carrying out all the terrorism. They certainly weren't carrying out all the terrorism in Ireland. But the Irish police are pretty convinced, for example, that the Glenane gang, working with the British intelligence services, carried out the Dublin and Monaghan bombs in 1972. The biggest single death toll of the Troubles. I think 27 people died, hundreds were injured, all civilians, carried out by loyalist terror gang who were given their weapons and explosives and direction by the Force Research Unit of the British Army, headed by Brigadier Gordon Kerr. Now you'll see I'm using names, times, and dates. Brigadier Gordon Kerr. Now people can just do a web search and find out what's happened to him. He was accused by Sir John Stevens of the Metropolitan Police of being the mastermind of all of this stuff, and then he just disappeared. Where is he? What's going on with him? He's possibly sitting around in Jordan or in Turkey right now, carrying on where he left off in Ireland.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for naming names, Martin, and thank you ever so much for your font of knowledge. For me personally, it's been a real pleasure to talk with you and pick your brains. And thank you ever so much for being with us. We're almost at the end of the Bunker Show now, so I'm just going to say thank you to Jimmy for co-hosting.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Martin. It's been absolutely brilliant. I'd love to talk to you again. And just a big shout out to the Cannabis Compassion Club coming up next. And see you next week, Helen.
And on the Cannabis Compassion Club, they've got Neil Woods, who spent 23 years as a police officer and is now turning his life around and working with law enforcement against Prohibition UK. And so that'll be a great show coming up. And after that, Max Steele. Martin, thank you ever so much, and hope to speak to you again sometime in the future, and hopefully our audience will tune into you on Fridays at thisweek.org.uk.
Well, that's fine. Thank you very much for your time, and let's keep up the good fight.
Keep up the good work, sir.
Thank you. And just before we go, if you're in Nottingham, there's a shout out for a premiere of One by One, Rick Mayall's last film that he made in the UK, and that's on Friday and Sunday the 21st at Screen 22 at 4 and 7 p.m. if you can't make that, there's also a premiere in London at Premier Cinema of Romford on Thursday, the 25th of June at 8 p.m. And lastly, goodbye from the Westminster Bunker. Hopefully catch you at the same time next week. We hope you've liked what you've heard today, and we'll tune in again next week. Thank you.
Good night, Fabrice, and thank you, guys.
Right.